There are words that outlive the person who spoke them. Not because they were extraordinary words, not because they were polished into the kind of memorable phrasing that gets carved into stone or printed in collections of quotations or cited in speeches by people who never met the person who said them, but because they were said at the right moment, by the right person, to the right listener, with the specific and unrepeatable weight of a life behind them. Words that arrived carrying everything the speaker had learned and everything the speaker had failed to learn and everything the speaker had come to understand only at the end, when understanding arrived too late to be applied but just in time to be given away. Words that land not in the ear but somewhere deeper, somewhere that does not forget even when the mind is not actively remembering, somewhere that sends the words back up, years later, at exactly the moments when they are most needed. Most of us have received such words at some point. From a grandparent, perhaps, or a teacher, or a mentor whose influence came in concentrated form at the end of something. Or from a parent. From the particular person whose words carry, regardless of the relationship's complications or the history's difficulties, a specific gravity that no other person's words quite replicate. Because a parent's words arrive from the direction of the person who was there at the beginning, who knew you before you knew yourself, who has watched the whole of what you have been with a continuity of attention that nobody else in the world can provide. This is a story about a father's last advice. Not the advice he planned to give, not the carefully considered, prepared, optimized version of wisdom that a person might compose in advance if they had the luxury of advance. The advice that came from the specific, unguarded, final day's honesty of a man who understood that the time for preparation had passed and that what remained was simply truth, offered plainly, to the son who was sitting beside him. The son's name was Daniel. He was 36 years old and he had driven 4 hours to be at his father's bedside and he would drive 4 hours back and he would do this every weekend for the final 6 weeks of his father's life. Because the driving was what was available and he was not the kind of person who offered what was convenient when what was needed was what was available. His father's name was Francis. He was 68 years old. The illness had arrived with the specific unfairness of serious illness, not in old age, not after a long and fully completed life, but at 68, which is old enough to have done a great deal and not old enough to have done everything, which is perhaps the most difficult timing illness can choose. Francis had been a carpenter. He had worked wood for 40 years. His hands, even in the illness, retained the particular shape of hands that have held tools for decades, strong in specific places, the grip still present even when the strength behind it was not. Daniel and his father had not always been easy together. This is worth saying because the story of a father's last advice is not always the story of a relationship that was simple or uncomplicated or free of the specific friction that fathers and sons sometimes generate between them across the decades of their knowing each other. They had been close in Daniel's childhood and more distant in his adolescence and something in between for most of his adult years. The distance of two people who loved each other and who had never quite found the language to say so without the saying of it feeling effortful in a way that other things between them did not feel effortful. They spoke about practical things. They had opinions about the same sports teams and disagreed about most politics and agreed about most food and could spend an afternoon together in the workshop with the comfortable parallel silence of two people who had no particular need to fill space with words. The love was real and the language for it was limited, and neither of them had previously found this insufficient because the love did not require the language to be real. The illness changed the terms. Not dramatically and not all at once. The illness changed them the way tide changes a beach, gradually and completely, until what you are standing on is recognizably related to what it was before and also entirely different. The things that had not been said began to have an urgency they had not previously had, because the saying of them now had a deadline that the before did not have. Francis did not become a different person in his illness. He became a more concentrated version of the same person. The qualities that had always been his qualities were simply more present, less diluted by the ordinary concerns of a life that was still being lived in the full sense. He had more time to think. He had less pretense about what the thinking was for. The first piece of advice arrived on a Saturday afternoon in October, the third weekend of the 6. They had been talking about something ordinary, the football, the weather, the progress of a neighbor's house extension that Francis had been following with professional interest from his window, and there was a pause, and Francis looked at Daniel with the particular directness that illness sometimes produces in people who have decided they do not have the time left for indirection, and he said, I spent too long worrying about what people thought of my work. Daniel waited. This was not the beginning of a conversation he had expected, and he had learned, in the previous 2 weekends, to wait when his father began something unexpected rather than responding immediately and possibly deflecting it. Francis said, "The work was good. I know it was good. I knew it was good most of the time while I was doing it. But I worried anyway. About whether the client would think it was good. About whether the other carpenters would respect it. About whether it was good enough by whatever standard I was imagining people were applying. And the worrying was a waste. It did not improve the work. It just occupied the space where the satisfaction of doing good work should have been." He paused. Then he said, "Do the work. Trust the work. Let the work be enough. The opinions will sort themselves out." Daniel wrote this down after he got home. Not on his phone, in a notebook, which felt like the appropriate medium for something said in the specific gravity of that room by the specific person in those specific circumstances. He wrote it as closely as he could recall it, knowing that the recall was imperfect and that the imperfection was itself a form of the thing being translated from one person to another, which is always imperfect and always the only way it can happen. The second piece of advice came the following weekend. It came unprompted, in the middle of the afternoon, while Daniel was reading in the chair beside the bed and Francis had appeared to be sleeping and turned out not to have been. He said, without preamble, "I should have rested more." Daniel looked up. Francis's eyes were open and he was looking at the ceiling with the expression of someone reviewing something. He said, "I thought rest was for when the work was done. The work was never done. So I never rested properly. Not the way rest is supposed to work, not the rest that puts something back, that makes the next day's work better than yesterday's. I rested the way a car idles at a traffic light. Just enough to keep moving. Not enough to actually recover. And the not recovering accumulated. Not in ways I noticed until I looked back. But it accumulated." He turned his head and looked at Daniel. He said, "Rest is not a reward for finished work. It is part of the work. The part that makes the rest of it possible. Do not wait until it is done to rest. It will not be done." Daniel wrote this down too. He was beginning to understand that the weekends were producing something he had not anticipated. Not the farewell visit of conventional imagination, the drawn-out goodbye of two people marking time until the ending. Something more specific and more valuable than that. His father was giving him things. Not possessions, there were possessions too, practical things that Francis had organized with the characteristic forethought of a practical man, but those were not the things. These were the things. The distillations. The things that 40 years of working and living and making mistakes and occasionally getting things right had compressed into the specific, plain sentences of a man who had run out of time for anything other than the essential. The third piece of advice was the hardest. It came in the 5th weekend, when Francis was weaker and the conversations were shorter and what was said carried the particular weight of things that are being said with the awareness that the opportunities for saying are becoming fewer. Francis said, "I was not always easy to love." Daniel said, immediately and honestly, "I know." Francis said, "I know you know. I am not telling you something you do not know. I am telling you because I want you to understand why. Not as an excuse. Understanding is not the same as excusing." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I came from a man who was not easy to love either. And I told myself for most of my life that I had escaped that. That I was different. That because I was aware of it I had avoided it." He paused. "I was not as different as I told myself. I had some of the same, the distance, the difficulty with the words, the way I showed love through doing things rather than saying things and assumed the doing was enough. Sometimes the doing was enough. Sometimes it was not." Daniel was not going to pretend this was not true. He said nothing. His father continued. He said, "What I want to tell you is this. Know the ways you are like the people who raised you. Not to be ashamed of them and not to let them run you without examination. Just know them. Because the things in you that came from somewhere else will run on their own if you do not know they are running. And sometimes where they run is not where you want to go." He looked at Daniel. He said, "You are a good man. You are a better man than I knew how to be at your age. But you have some of my distance. I can see it. Know that you have it. That is all. Just know. This was the advice that Daniel carried most carefully and most honestly. Not because it was the most comfortable, it was the least comfortable. But because it required something of him that the other pieces of advice did not require. Not the application of a principle but the examination of himself in a specific and unflattering light, and the willingness to hold what the examination revealed without either dismissing it or being destroyed by it. His father had given him a mirror. Deliberately and with love. The kind of love that offers the true reflection rather than the flattering one, because the true reflection is what is actually useful. He thought about his own relationships. He thought about the woman he had been with for 4 years, a woman he loved and who loved him, and between whom there was, in certain moments and around certain subjects, a quality of careful distance that he had always attributed to the nature of the relationship and that he now began to examine from a different angle. He thought about his friends and the specific ways in which he showed up for them, reliably in practical terms and occasionally less reliably in the emotional terms that practical reliability can sometimes substitute for without quite replacing. He thought about the distance his father had named, and he held it honestly, and he did not like what the holding revealed, and he did not put it down, because putting it down would have been a waste of the gift. The final advice came in the last weekend. Francis was very weak by then, and the conversations were brief and the brevity was honest. Not the result of there being nothing to say but of the energy for saying being mostly spent. They sat in the particular silence of a father and son who have, in the previous 5 weekends, said more to each other than they said in the previous 36 years combined, and who are now on the other side of the saying and can sit in the silence with the specific quality of people for whom the silence is full rather than empty. Near the end of the afternoon, Francis said, "One more thing." Daniel waited. Francis said, "The wood teaches you things if you let it. Every piece of wood is different. Same species, same forest, same tree even. Cut 2 boards from the same tree and they will behave differently. Different grain, different response to the tool, different thing they want to become. The carpenter who fights this, who insists the wood be what he wants it to be rather than what it is, makes harder work for himself and worse furniture. The carpenter who listens to the wood, who learns what this particular piece wants to do and works with that, makes better things with less struggle." He looked at Daniel. He said, "People are like wood. Every person is different, even from the people they come from, even from the people most similar to them. The man who insists people be what he wants them to be makes harder work for himself and worse relationships. Listen to the people in your life. Not to fix them. Not to understand them so you can manage them. Just to hear what they actually are. You will be surprised what people tell you when they feel actually heard." Daniel held this. The carpenter's metaphor was so entirely his father, so completely the language of the man who had spent 40 years in conversation with wood, that it arrived as both advice and as a final, concentrated expression of who Francis was. The advice and the advisor were inseparable. The wisdom and the life that had generated it were the same thing. His father was giving him, in the language of the work he had loved, the understanding the work had given him. The work had taught him things. He was passing on what the work had taught. Francis died 11 days later. The dying was peaceful in the way that the dying of people who have made their peace with dying tends to be peaceful, not free of difficulty, not free of the physical reality of what dying requires of a body, but peaceful in the deeper sense of a person who has done what they needed to do and said what they needed to say and who is not leaving with the weight of the unsaid pressing on them. Daniel was not there at the moment of the death. He was on the road, 4 hours away, having driven back on the Sunday not knowing it would be the last Sunday. He received the call on his phone in a service station car park and he sat in his car for a long time. He had the notebook. For weekends of advice from his father, written down as accurately as imperfect recall allowed, in the notebook that he carried because the phone had seemed like the wrong medium and he had been right about this. He read through it in the car park. He read it the way you read something that is doing 2 things at once, comforting and devastating, giving and taking. He felt the loss fully. He also felt something else, something that the loss did not cancel but that existed alongside it with the specific, strange coexistence of things that are real and that seem like they should not be able to coexist but do. He felt gratitude. Not for the death, not for the illness or the timing or any of the facts that had produced this particular ending. For the 6 weekends. For the October afternoon when his father had said I spent too long worrying about what people thought of my work. For the distance his father had named in him and the mirror he had held up and the love that was in the holding. For the wood, and what the wood taught, and the way his father had put it in the language that was entirely his. He had been given something. Not everything, the full man, the full relationship, the full history of a father and son who had loved each other in the limited language available to them and who had never quite fully crossed the distance. Not all of that had been given. But something. For weekends of something. The distillation of a life in the plain sentences of a man who had run out of time for anything other than the essential. He drove home. He called the woman he had been with for 4 years. He told her about his father. And then, because his father had told him to listen to the people in his life, not to fix them, not to manage them, but to hear what they actually are, he asked her how she was. Not how are you as a social formality. Actually asked. With the quality of attention that his father had described in the language of wood. He listened to what she said with the specific, unhurried attention of someone who is trying to hear what a person actually is rather than what he has been expecting them to be. She noticed. She said, "You seem different." He said, "I had a good teacher. He keeps the notebook. It is not on a shelf, it is in the drawer of the desk where he works, where he can reach it without looking, where his hand finds it occasionally on an ordinary morning when the reach for it is not a decision but a reflex, the body knowing before the mind does that what is needed is in the drawer. He reads it when he is worried about what people think of his work. He reads it when he has been running without resting. He reads it when he can feel the distance his father named closing in around him and he needs the reminder that the distance is not inevitable. It is a tendency, and tendencies can be interrupted by the simple, daily, sometimes difficult choice to close the space and be actually present with the person who is actually there. Do the work. Trust the work. Let the work be enough. Rest is part of the work. Know the ways you are like the people who raised you. Listen to what people actually are. 4 pieces of advice from a carpenter who worked wood for 40 years. Simple sentences. Plain words. The language of a man who did not have the vocabulary of therapy or philosophy or the self-help section of a bookshop. The language of someone who had learned things from living and who, at the end of the living, found a way to pass them on in the 6 weekends that remained. Who gave his son a mirror and a metaphor and the specific, ordinary, entirely sufficient wisdom of a life worked honestly from the inside. The words outlived him. They are still working. On ordinary Tuesdays and difficult Fridays and the mornings when the distance closes in and the reach for the drawer is the most honest thing available. They are still there, in the imperfect recall of a son who wrote them down as accurately as he could and who reads them as carefully as they were given. They were given with love. They are received with love. The love does not require more language than that. It never did.